5 titles probably doesn't qualify as a whole. This is Parade's End, the Quran, George Orwell's A Life in Letters and Diaries, and Revelations of Divine Love by the Anchoress Julian of Norwich, and The Fables of Aesop. These are from Folio Society's Summer Sale 2020. I prefer to call it mid-year sale because it's a bit confusing for us up here, down here, not up here. Well, it depends on which way you're looking at, I suppose, in the globe. It's winter for us down here. So Folio Society has 2 sales, mid-year and beginning of each year. And the New Year's sale is actually a lot more, they have a lot more going, I believe. But for whatever reason, for me, it's a lot easier to have fun with the mid-year sale, I suppose, because I started off discovering Folio Society, although 20 or so years ago, I've only discovered their online shopping last year, mid-year sometimes. So because I started with the mid-year sale, it takes about a year to recover, and it's a lot easier to wait a year rather than to shop another round of sales only 6 months after. But I am quite determined to make it to the New Year's sale for 2021 because I do believe that there's a lot more offerings. They seem to have a lot more offerings in their New Year's sale. Folio Society in general isn't really necessarily collectible if you want to collect them, of course, because it's a lovely edition of very well-known titles, such as this one here. None of these titles here are new, but you just have this lovely, lovely version of it. And some of them have been printed 12 times, so one of these are in their 12th printing, for example. So I'm not quite sure about this one, but this is definitely not new material. I've seen this title as A Life in Letters. This one is A Life in Letters and Diaries. I am not very familiar with English literature, to be honest. I came to New Zealand in 1989, and I was in my late teens by then. And I grew up in Indonesia, or some people who are older, my parents' generation, would know the country as the Dutch East Indies. And unlike our cousins in Malaysia and Singapore, we grew up under the Dutch instead of the British. And unlike our cousins in Malaysia and Singapore, we weren't the country, or it wasn't really a country back then, several hundred years ago. We weren't ruled under the crown, but under a trading company, a Dutch trading company, the East Indies Trading Company. So their aim is more profit-oriented rather than, the more noble aspirations of civilizing the savages, so to speak. So when I moved to New Zealand, I was very fascinated with understanding the culture that I have to live under. And there's no English language resources are quite scarce. When I was growing up in Indonesia in the 70s and 80s. I'm going to quickly read this about George Orwell here, 1903 to 1950. Some of us know him through his work, Animal Farms. Was born Eric Arthur Blair in Motihari, India, where his father worked for the civil service, into what he would later call a lower upper middle class family. The family returned to England in 1907, and after studying at Eton, Orwell joined the Indian Imperial Force, the Imperial Police Force in Burma. Whilst in Burma, he developed a critical attitude towards authority, which he evoked in his first novel, Burmese Days, 1934. He resigned from the police force in 1927 and took to exploring the poverty of his home country, traveling, observing, and often living as a tramp with a view to becoming a writer. He lived in Paris for 2 years before returning to England, where he worked successively as a private tutor, school teacher, and bookshop assistant, and contributed reviews and articles to a number of periodicals. His first work of non-fiction, Down and Out in Paris and London, was published in 1936, and in the same year he was commissioned by Victor Gollancz, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that name, to visit areas of mass unemployment in Lancaster and Yorkshire. The Road to Wigan Pier, 1937, was his powerful description of the poverty he saw there. He fought in the Spanish Civil War, experiencing the factionalism breaking apart the Republican cause, and became virulently anti-communist. I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing this properly. A stance reflected in his Homage to Catalonia, 1938. During the Second World War, Orwell served in the Home Guard and worked for the BBC Eastern Service. As literary editor of Tribune, he contributed a regular page of political and literary commentary, and also wrote for The Observer and the Manchester Evening News. His political satire, Animal Farm, was published shortly after the end of the war in 1945. And it was this novel, together with 1984, which was written in 1949, which brought him worldwide fame. So I know him, of course, through Animal Farm and 1984, which as a young person in the Republic of Indonesia, 1970s, 1980s, it was arguably under a dictatorship. Although it didn't feel like it at the time, because it just felt like life, because that's the only life I knew as a child, I suppose. I lived in Belgium for 3 years when I followed my mom and dad when my father was there for graduate studies. But as a 3-year-old to a 5-year-old, my perception of the world was rather limited. The Animal Farm was introduced to me in a form of a cartoon, which we can only watch. The only English language exposure I had was through American movies or TV series deemed appropriate and heavily censored by the Republic at the time on the only one national TV. And other than that, it was a lot of pirated, not VHS, it was Betamax, which actually is a better quality tape compared to the VHS. But that's a story for another time. And Animal Farm, the animation version, was one of those that my father had brought home for us to watch. And this is the only way for us to be able to see the rest of the world uncensored, basically. And it contributed to my learning how to speak English. I didn't grow up in an English-speaking environment. I was never taught English in any way. I simply picked the language up from watching these videos. And so that was my only introduction to Orwell. And when I came to New Zealand, I was busy studying and doing other things. And I have not yet explored this author as much as I wished. So this is my first step into understanding his life and his story, I suppose. And to those of you who are wondering, as someone of Peranakan Chinese descent, grew up in Indonesia, spent some time in Singapore, in Europe as well as in the States, with a history of a confused identity as to whether I'm Chinese, am I Indonesian, am I a Kiwi, and decided that I'm everything and all of the above. My fascination to understanding the English speaking world stemmed from the need to survive under it, and not only to survive but to thrive under an English speaking world with all its history and all its cultural artifacts which dominate the world I am living in the 20th and 21st century. So this is part of my fascination with English speaking authors. I do miss exploring Asian authors though, Japanese, Chinese, and South Asian authors as well. I was going to say Indian, but Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and those guys were one people before they were split apart, sadly, under colonial rules. But when I was living in Singapore, there's a lot more exposure through a Japanese bookshop called Kinokuniya, where I can just go there and basically explore all these various Asian authors translated, or those Asian authors who wrote in English. A lot of the South Asian authors, for example, Indian authors, English is their first language. English, like in Malaysia and Singapore, for a lot of people, English is their second language, their first language, because it's the only way for them to communicate to their fellow citizens and people of the country who do not necessarily come from the same ethnic backgrounds and therefore do not necessarily speak the same language as themselves. And Kinokuniya provide all these beautiful arrays where you could just go in there and just pick one. So you can be very experimental about it. And now that I live in New Zealand, I have to know a particular Asian author who writes various books before I can search for them. Do you know what I mean? So this is the Quran. I've always been curious about the content of the Quran. And this is an English translation of the Quran. This is a bit about the illustrations. So the Mamluk, and if you remember, Mamluk is also the dynasty that is responsible for leaving us the oldest playing card that survived today, the Mamluk cards. We call them Mamluk cards, or the Topkapi, Topkapa. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. So the Mamluk Sultan Baibars commissioned the Quran, which bears his name, in 1304. So that's a year 704 in the Islamic calendar. Its 7 volumes were produced in Cairo between 1304 and 1306. One of the most magnificent of all Islamic manuscripts. The text throughout is in gold, the work of the calligrapher Muhammad ibn al-Wahid. Decorations was added by the team of the master illuminator Abu Bakr, also known as Sandal. The illustrations from the Sultan Baibars Quran included in this book are taken from Surah 1, between pages 4 to 5, Surah 2, verse 255, between pages 20 and 21, Surah 7, verses 171 to 172, etc. So Sultan Baibars Quran is held in the British Library. So this, I believe, is a reproduction of that. If that is not the accurate understanding, feel free to correct me down below. So let's have a look at between pages 4 and 5. This book is quite 4 and 5. This book is actually very, oh, there it is. This book is very light, considering its thickness, and I think it's because of the paper. The paper is one of those where it feels like it's thick, but it's kind of light. It's airy, it's fluffy, so it's thick, but it feels like there's a lot of air in it, that it's hollow. So that it, in comparison to the kind of papers that I truly dislike in books, which is more like this, a lot of it is glossy, like this one here. Some books, for whatever reason, choose to print on the whole book with this kind of paper here, like you see here. So they're glossy throughout, and they're heavy. So those books are thin but extremely heavy and extremely expensive to ship. It's unpleasant to read because of the glare, and when you annotate, especially with pencil, because I really dislike annotating permanent with permanent ink. So I usually put pencil, and pencils would rub off on those, as you can imagine, on those this kind of material here, and it's just ended up becoming quite a mess. So that's the Quran, and I've marked here about women because traditional, institutionalized, especially Abrahamic religion, have always been accused of being not as friendly to women's, independence, authority, and etc., etc. So I found this really interesting. Yeah, so I can't review the Quran surely. And the thing about holy text is like the Bibles, like the Bible, it's very translation dependent. And so the various translations are really, translating two different languages requires that one make interpretations, especially when the texts are so old and the language are no longer spoken in a way that they're spoken today. And so, and I am not likely to start comparing various translation versions of the Quran, but I'm simply trying to highlight that I understand the limitation of translated work, even when they were translated within the same century, let alone when they're translated across the centuries. And so I can comment more on the various translation versions of the Bible, which I might do in the future. But I am very well aware of the limitation of whatever I read in this book. This is gilded at the top, as traditionally books are, because it is protecting them from the sun and from dust as well, as books are often stored this way, with this one against the wall or against the back of the shelf. And of course, the only thing that is exposed is the top. When you store it like so, the top is heavily exposed. So they usually are covered with either colored gilding or a more luxurious one like this one here. So this heavy, thick, big book is relatively light, which I think is really good. And it's not only sitting on top of the surface there, but it's impressed upon on the what I believe is buckram, and so it's quite lovely there. So there's a lot of, it's impressed on the cover, and that's pretty cool. Okay, so next book is the Fables of Aesop. Now this book is a reproduction of the first edition, and I could have sworn I've seen this somewhere. And when I saw this the version that I saw has this cover as a dust jacket. So this cover was a dust jacket in the version that I saw, and I can't remember where I saw that. I don't believe it was the first edition that I saw, but Aesop's fables themselves are a lot older than the first edition of the book, obviously. So Folio Society 1998 here. I think that's the first edition of it. This isn't. There's a illustration, the town mouse and the country mouse, illustrated by Edward J. Detmold. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. This is, as you can see, 12th printing in 2018. So I don't know how collectible the first printing is. Folio Society books that are not limited edition tend not to be as highly collectible. It's their limited edition that can drive collectors quite crazy sometimes. So this one here was first published by, again, pardon my pronunciation, Hodder and Stoughton in 1909. I have a few Hodder and Stoughton editions or reproduction of their edition of a lot of tales. Peter Pan, 1001 Nights, all these. This name, Hodder and Stoughton, keep popping up again and again. So this is a facsimile, I believe, of the 1909 edition. So these are the contents. These are the various illustrations. This is bound in Italy, cloth blocked, with a design by the artist, redrawn by David Eccles. And again, I apologize for my lack of accuracy in pronouncing some names there. Modern extended printed. So the plates are on a different kind of paper. It's that glossy paper again. And the rest are in this lovely thick porous paper. So this is, and again, the top there, it's again covered, just the top, just to protect it from, I believe, from dust and from sunlight, so that it doesn't, because sometimes when the sun gets to, even though the book is closed and the sun get to it, it could actually penetrate and damage, for example, plates like this. So it can actually penetrate, the UV ray can actually penetrate the pages and damage, printing on the inside. And so one thing I have to say about this A Life in Letters and Diaries, George Orwell's here. You probably saw me trying to get it out of the slipcase. So slipcases, when they're tight like this, but it's curved, you can at least pull it out like this for your finger. There's room for your fingers. The slipcase for this one is very, very tight. It is created more like this one here. But if you could see this one here, it is it's flexible enough for my hand to go in there like that. But this particular, the slipcase for this one was very, very rigid, so I can't slip my hand in there, and there's no curve for it. So there's just, and it's tight, and it's extremely difficult to remove this from its slipcase. So sadly, I may have to leave this out of its slipcase entirely. So this one here is a book that I have in paperback, and I've decided that this is a seminal work enough. Is by an anchoress, by a mystic called Julian of Norwich. She basically buried herself alive, for lack of a better term. You became like an anchor in a church or in a chapel, and lock yourself forever inside a room where you simply just, well, not just, but from my point of view as an ordinary person, you spend your whole life locked up in self-isolation, separating yourself physically from the rest of the world, and you live the rest of your life in prayer and contemplation and in devotion and in adoration of God. And this is a very well-known work of hers. This is translation by, I think this is introduced by, and then there's calligraphy. So the calligraphy here, it's sort of like this drop cap style, old style. The first letter of the first paragraph is S-O, so you see this a lot in old books after, and some Bibles as well that's recently produced. There seemed to be a resurgence, a renaissance in spirituality these days. I think when people lost faith in human institutions, as you see throughout the centuries, there's a pendulum swing back to spirituality. Bible printing and Bible publishing is, I'll show you some of them. Is just unbelievable. The craftsmanship are amazing. And so that's, yeah. The one that I have is the one published by Oxford University Press. There's a few translations of this. So this in particular is translated by Barry Windet. Again, I apologize for my lack of accuracy in pronouncing some names here. So again in buckram, I believe, with this lovely imprinted. Again, you see the indentation there. The way she talks about God is like a mother hen, like it reminds us that the very paternalistic masculine God is potentially superimposed by sociocultural narratives of the time. And it's interesting that she talk about God almost in a feminine sense of it. And of course, God, if you believe God in the way that I do, is non-gendered, because, you know, it's not supposed to be human or humanoid. So yeah, so this work is very, very old, at least 600 years old. So there's that element of translating older texts as well, because I think modern English only emerged in the 1700s, so anything before that would have been written in Old English. No, sorry, in Middle English. Last but not least is this 2-book set, Parade's End, by Ford Madox Ford. So again, this isn't something I grew up with, and my introduction to the artifacts of the English-speaking world, a lot of them are through visual media, through TV series and movies. And, you know, one could argue that new imperialism is fought and lost in the media front. And so the only time I heard about Parade's End was when it was made a series, I believe by the BBC. I can't quite recall. And one of my favorite actors, even before he was famous, or even before he was famous outside of the UK, I suppose, Benedict Cumberbatch, is in it. And so this is a story of someone who came back from World War One, and I am absolutely fascinated by how things were in Western Europe after World War One. I have a degree of fascination with the early part of the 20th century, just before World War II, and an area just leading towards World War One. So the Edwardian period, late Victorian, the Art Nouveau, as the French call the aesthetic period of the early 1900s, or La Belle Époque. Again, I do apologize for my pronunciation. The beautiful period, it's called. It is a period, it seems like no other. And World War One changed the whole world into something that will never be again. And so I am very fascinated by stories from that period, because it defined the time I am currently living in. And so this here, the illustration is sitting on, unlike the other books I've shown you, it's not sitting on glossy paper, but it's this sort of textured, lovely textured matte paper, which I much prefer. You can see there. This book is a bit heavy, bear with me. I am doing this one hand so you could see that. Perhaps not so much. Let's go back to the colors. You could see it clearer there, like this orange peel there. So this reminds me of this wood block cut aesthetic here. Reminds me of a very famous pioneer in he's probably the first graphic novelist in the English-speaking world. I'll put his name down below. His name completely escaped my mind, sorry. I'll put his name down below. This reminds me very much of his aesthetic. So let me see if we... Illustration by James Alpin, 2014. So there it is, James Alpin. A Man Could Stand Up and Last Post were first published in Britain by Duckworth and Company in 1926 and 1928, respectively. This text follows that of the Carcanet, C-A-R-C-A-N-E-T editions, first published in Britain in 2011. This edition published by Folio Society, and this is 2014. It seems like, is this the first printing? It doesn't say. Maybe this is the only printing from 2014 and they haven't sold out yet. Who knows? So that's one there. And then the second is this one here. Yeah, there's no other dates, so I'm thinking this is still around from 2014. Again, if this is not true, please feel free to comment down below. Fort Maddox Fort was born Fort Herman Hofer in Merton, Surrey in 1873. So I wonder if he's one of those people who feel forced to change their names because it sounds very German in a way that my ancestors were forced to change their names by circumstance into something sounding a bit more Indonesian because it sounds too Chinese. The grandson of the artist Fort Maddox Brown. In 1908, he founded the English Review, a literary magazine, a prolific novelist, poet, editor, and critic. Fort's novels include Romance, a 1903 collaboration with Joseph Conrad, and The Good Soldier, published in 1915. In the same year, Fort enlisted in the army, where he served as an infantry officer. His experiences during the First World War with the Spire Parades and published in 4 parts between 1924 and 1928. After recuperating in Sussex countryside following the war, Ford moved to Paris, where he launched a second influential literary magazine, the Transatlantic Review. After spending the latter years of his life teaching in the United States, Ford died in Deauville, France in 1939. And then there's a bit about the artist, James Alban, graduated with BA in illustration from Edinburgh College of Art, where he subsequently worked as an artist in residence. He is an associate member of the Royal Society of Painter Printmakers, who awarded him the Gwen May Award in 2012. His reduction lino cut, that's the word I was looking for, lino cut, illustrations for Parade's End represent his first commission for the Folio Society and were completed in the Woodbank studio in Aberdeenshire over the summer of 2013. Philip Henshaw, I think he's the one who introduced the book, that's right, was born in London in 1965 and educated at Oxford and Cambridge. His books are Other Lulus, 1994, Kitchen Venom, 1996, which won the Somerset Maugham Award, Pleasure, 1998, a short story collection, The Bedroom of the Mister's Wife, 1999, The Mulberry Empire, 2002, The Fit, 2005, The Northern Clemency, 2008, which was shortlisted for the 2008 Man Booker Prize, King of the Badgers 2011, and Scenes from Early Life 2012, which won the Ondaatje Prize. I think that's named after the Dutch author, Michael Ondaatje, I don't know. So the Ondaatje Prize, he is a regular contributor of The Spectator, a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and professor of creative writing at the University of Bath Spa. Okay, so that is that lino cut. Yes, and that's that. I will talk to you later. Bye.